Hey there, thanks for listening in and welcome to another podcast in a one-on-one setting. Here we dive into the stories of new technologies and concepts that are transforming and empowering the geospatial industry, and here we learn about the founders behind them. Today in the spotlight is 52impact. My name is Rosalie van Maas and I'm co-founder of Ellipsis Drive, and here with me is our guest, Koen Verberne. Koen, thank you for joining. Please tell us a little bit more about you and about your journey up to founding 52impact.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be on this podcast and tell a little bit about 52impact and what we're doing. So we started in 2017, and we started with the basic assumption that in many industries, satellite Earth observation is not used as much as possible. So there are a lot of opportunities, but the opportunities are not seen by companies. So we started really broad in a lot of different types of use cases. And then I think after already some months, it became clear that water and also climate adaptation were actually two subjects or themes where we saw a lot of need in the market. I think nowadays it's even much more. Back then, I think it was more like coming up, at least in how I experienced it, that there was more awareness about, climate change is real, we know that, but now we also see it as a company as it hits our production, especially related to water. Companies that need water, also companies in the agricultural supply chain, but also food and beverage companies, financial institutes, basically any industry is reliant on water. And we're thinking, how are we going to analyze those water risks? To what water risks are we exposed as a company? And what kind of solution can we then deploy to actually monitor and assess those risks? And then what can we do about it? How can we mitigate those risks? And that was for us a very interesting spot to be in. So first of all, satellite Earth observation had a lot of advantages due to the historical data sets that we have. We could make trend analysis. But also we had a global coverage. So for every spot on the Earth, we could provide information. And later in the development of 52impact and our services, we more and more did with things with other data sets, but also a climate model, so that we were also able to say something about the future. We do not develop any climate models ourselves, so we are totally reliant on especially scientific communities that are developing these climate models, but we can apply them for certain use cases. And that combination of modeling and real observation, so to speak, works from our point of view, is really strong from our point of view to understand what kind of risks companies are exposed to in relation to water and climate.
Okay. And you mentioned climate risks and water risks. How should I understand water risk? Like, what type of risks are there? And say you are a beverage company, what are the things that you and 52impact are analyzing for them?
That's an excellent question, because you're totally right. Water risk can mean a lot of things. So we are mainly focusing on water availability or the risks and water scarcity, and also water quality. And those are more like physical risks that we can actually analyze. Often we also do a little bit of an analysis related to regulations, but the main part of what we do is water availability and water quality, and then it all comes to how much water is used in, for example, a certain water basin, and how much water comes into that water basin. And if you look at both, then you can see, is there, for example, overexploitation of water? If we look at our clients, as said, our clients are using, in most cases, water directly for their production. Think about beverages. Beverage companies normally use a lot of water to produce the beverages, but are also indirectly hit by water scarcity because their supply chain is also dependent on water. Think about a beverage company that uses sugarcane or maybe grapes or barley. All those crops need water as well. So then they are not only interested in their production sites, but also the sourcing areas where they source these crops from. And I think one of the advantages of how we work and also the technologies that we use is that we can deploy them everywhere. So that we have basically one type of system. We always adapt it a little bit, but then we can just roll it out to all the different areas where it is needed.
So what does that say about the scalability of your own operations? Because it makes sense. Like if you want to map out water risk, you need to map it out for the entire supply chain, which is likely to be global in this world, which shouldn't be a problem for your system because indeed it can be globally deployed. You mentioned some things you need to tweak still. Like to what degree do you feel the services you offer are inherently scalable? And to what degree do you feel a human touch will always be necessary?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So it is scalable as you explained, and also as I said, you can do it globally. But we really need human beings, and the reason that we need that we really need humans is interpretation. So you can. So what we do is we do not only say things like the amount of rain in a certain months or certain years, and the temperature and reservoirs and whatnot. You can monitor them all, but eventually our client needs to know, okay, but how does that affect us? And for that step, interpretation of a human, of a person, helps tremendously. It's difficult to automate that part. So that's also one of the reasons why in 52impact we do not only have data science team, but also people with, for example, a background in hydrology.
That was actually my next question.
Yeah, because to actually make that translation. Also because what's for us very important, think again about a supply chain, a crop, for example, barley. We also study then barley. So how resilient is barley to certain temperatures? Or to say in other words, what kind of temperature does it need? It sounds a bit strange, but you have certain thresholds. And within those thresholds, it's fine for barley, but above or below, it has problems. Same for precipitation, same for extreme weather. So we first have to know, okay, what are those thresholds? And then we look at all the data that we have to see how often, how frequently does it happen that that barley runs into problems. And that's then basically your risk. And for those type of interpretations, you need a human. So that's one part of I think the answer to your question. So partly scalable, partly there is a human needed. And the other thing is also that we see that at the one end we look at global problems, but those problems are also local, and that's especially related to water. So it is global in the sense that in a lot of places there are problems related to water, but at the same time, all those problems are a little bit different in nature. And for our clients and for us, it's not enough to say like, okay, in that region there's a problem with water scarcity. No, we need to know why is it a water scarce area? Is it due to overconsumption in agriculture? Is it because there are certain periods during the year where it is drier than normal, whereas maybe on an annual basis there's enough precipitation? Is there a lot of erosion? You can think of a lot of different reasons why there is a problem, and we need to analyze that because otherwise we cannot identify what you can do about it. And by the way, there also human is really needed. Like how can we mitigate it? You can automate it a little bit. There are algorithms that can tell you, okay, if this is a problem, then you might look at these type of solutions. But a human is definitely needed to interpret everything. Last but not least, there's also a social reality. You cannot deploy any solution for any place. It really depends on what can people do. Is there enough funding, for example, etc. Not everything is physical in that sense.
So I have two questions based on this. One is to do with where does your expertise or service end? Like, as you mentioned, you can basically go into full-on agronomics. Where do you consider someone else takes over? Or when are you pushing the boundaries of what it is that you look into? Yeah,
so also we had to explore this in the last years because there was a time that actually, we didn't really know. So it was a little bit like also trial and error to see, okay, what is our where do we feel comfortable and where not? And I think there's a clear cut where it comes to when it comes to implementation. So we definitely do not do implementations. That's a total different type of expertise. And also I think, and that's a little bit more vague, but you mentioned I would say expertise related to agriculture, we can assess, for example, the characteristics of a crop, but there comes a point where we say, okay, now we need external expertise. Then we can go from to university or to a company that's specialized on or has expertise related to a specific subject related to agriculture. Same applies, for example, for stakeholder assessment. So, as I said, the social environment is very important when you look at water-related challenges or climate-related challenges. A stakeholder assessment, we have some tooling that can scout certain stakeholders, but there comes a point where we actually use ourselves consultants that have the expertise in doing stakeholder assessments for companies, and then we hire those.
Got it. So that actually builds a great bridge towards the other question that came up for me based on what you've said earlier, and that's that of like social justice. Like you mentioned stakeholders a number of times. We all know, water is a valuable and scarce resource, and a lot of people can lay claim to it. To what degree do you meddle in this? Maybe meddling is the wrong word, but yet, how far would you take your own involvement in social justice around water access and water use?
Yeah, you mean our own responsibility in terms of how the data is used?
Not necessarily. Well, that as well, but also in terms of if you have a catchment and you know that there are large corporations that are using up a lot of water, but at the same time there are local stakeholders and perhaps subsistence farmers at the same time. I can imagine these can be very hairy problems. And to what degree does this become political for you? Maybe a difficult question, but I do wonder about it.
No, it's a good question. It's a fair question, I think. I think for us, in most, I think in all our cases, when a client comes to us for when they have a need for our services, it is in almost all cases that they want to mitigate certain water risks or climate risk within their watershed where they are active, or watersheds where they are active. And they are, in most cases, aware that, first of all, they are not the largest water user. In almost any case, it's the agricultural sector that's using the most water. And that means that if they want to mitigate their risk, so even from their own interest, it is in their best interest to collaborate with others to make the watershed more healthy. And in that sense, I think that the interests within a watershed, not in all cases, but in a lot of cases, the interests within the watershed of multiple stakeholders are aligned in the sense that it's in the best interests of all to make the watershed a little bit more healthy by, for example, using water more efficiently, maybe to implement, I just mentioned something, a nature-based solution, reforestation or something to contain more water in that watershed. So in that sense, I think in most cases where we work, it's more that what we provide, information data, is an enabler for understanding what the problem is, that what can you do about that problem, what's the solution, and also understand which solution is the most effective given the stakeholders in that watershed. And then those stakeholders can then collaborate to actually make it happen. And then I think what helps, some of our bigger clients, they often work with smaller farmers, and there we actually see that the larger company is able to do investments that small farmers cannot do by themselves because they do not have the means to do that. So I think in most cases, it's not that we are involved in a case where it is that political, and I think one of the reasons is that if it is really, really political, in most cases, organizations do not want a company that is going to monitor with satellites everything that's happening.
That is true. When things get political, the need for transparency disappears. So that's a positive thing, though. It's positive that you find that stakeholders can be aligned and that they can reinforce each other in a positive way, which I imagine is not the case everywhere, but it's good to hear that in the cases where you get involved, there's light at the horizon.
Yeah.
So you also mentioned climate models a few times, and this is something I find very interesting. Also, Ellipsis Drive as a company, we've had companies and founders on the podcast before who consider it their business to build climate models, to use them to create all sorts of scenarios, water related and otherwise. How do these feed into your processes? Like you mentioned on a high level, what it looks like to understand a watershed or a catchment. But could you shed some more light on the use of climate models, or perhaps collaborations that you may build with scientific communities to, improve the work that you do?
Yeah. So the good thing is that a lot of climate models are open access, so you can use them we can use them, others can use them as well, and that enables us to deploy climate models that we would never be able to develop ourselves because it's too scientifically complex to do that. It is important in our work because satellite Earth observation is an observation, so you cannot look into the future. And with climate models, you can at least provide some scenarios for basically the next 100 years. However, for our clients, we often provide 10, 20, 30 years from now, so until 2050, because that's a skill on which it is easier to have a strategy. It's very difficult to have a strategy for the next 100 years. It's easier to have a strategy for the next 30 years, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And then what we basically do is to see, in relation to water, for example, how does the expected climate change affect, for example, water availability? And then we look at key climatic variables like temperature and precipitation, but also derived things like extreme weather events. We take into account. We do the same thing for crops. So think again about the supply chain. Crops are needed for the production, and the question is: are certain areas? Is it expected that in 10, 20, or 30 years from now we can still source those crops from these areas, or is it expected that other crops will come from those areas and we have to go to another area, or what are the risks and how can we mitigate those risks in those areas? And then we can collaborate with farmers in those areas to actually mitigate those climate risks. And I think it's kind of powerful when you look at satellite Earth observation. You have, for example, data sets of the last 40 years, and you can also look at the trend for the next 30 years based on these scenarios. However, they are scenarios. A lot of things are unknown related to how climate works. Also, scientific communities are always warning about this. Like, we do not know how everything interacts. Mm-hmm. So what we provide is often 3 scenarios. Like, one is middle of the road, one is a best and worst case, so to speak. But at least you have a little bit of a bandwidth, and then you can say, like, okay, we have a strategy. How resilient is our strategy to these different scenarios?
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. I'd like to jump quickly to something you're mentioning on your website, which we found interesting. It says too much focus is on what's going wrong instead of what is done right. Could you elaborate on this statement? What does this mean to you?
Yeah, it's a bit that sometimes what we see, not only among companies, by the way, also I see it among my friends, for example, that things like climate change or water-related issues can be seen as so complex and so overwhelming that people can have the feeling like, I find it really important, but I just do not know where to start. And then the attitude is like, okay, then I don't do anything. Mm-hmm. By the way, my friends are saying that it's not really a problem, but when large companies are thinking that, then it is a problem, actually, or governments. And the good thing is that there is an increasing awareness, I think, among companies that it is relevant. There's, I think, also increasing awareness that you can actually do something, at least on a local level. And what our job is, I think, to be that enabler, to reduce a little bit of the complexity and saying, like, look, guys, we think we have a good analysis for you to see what the problems actually are. And we can also provide certain solutions that you can actually implement. And then you know where to start and how effective those implementations can be. And then later we can also monitor if it was really effective. And in that sense, what the quote you were referring to is a little bit like that. So not only focus on, everything is problematic and we cannot do anything, but no, there are real problems, real big problems. But come on, guys, we can really try to solve them with
So
data and information.
It's not so much about looking at the world through pink glasses, but more about focusing on the things you can control and the things that have proven or have been proven to work.
Yeah, exactly.
And not use it as an excuse to indeed just sit on your hands.
No, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's good, I think, to worry about these problems. I think they are real problems, and we should try to solve them. But if you worry, then things like, okay, now I cannot solve it, so I'm not going to do anything, then that's a real problem, I think.
So the company is called 52impact. I'm not going to ask about the 52, or if you want to elaborate, feel free. But I want to focus on the impact. Where do you feel most impact has been made by you? Is there a project that you're incredibly proud of, or a specific area in which you feel you and your team make the most of a difference, or perhaps the biggest challenge that you guys have faced and solved?
I think that the projects or the services that we deployed were for a large set of production sites of food and beverage companies, where we analyzed what the water and climate risks are, and then the also provided solutions. I think those had real impact because again, it's an enabler. So in itself, information doesn't solve anything, but when you provide the information and then a company says, okay, now we know where we have to put our funding, or where we have to invest in terms of mitigating water risk, not only for themselves, but for the whole watershed. Again, often smaller farmers and others are then also benefiting. I think there is really where our impact is, and I think real positive impact. And again, I think we have to be a little bit humble because the data itself didn't do it. Again, here the people are needed to actually implement it. But I do feel that we had a good, that we had a positive impact in the sense of showing the map, almost quite literally, showing the map where to do what. And that I think helped, there we had, I think, a lot of impact in those type of projects.
Yeah, because I mean, it sounds like you're working with companies that may be considered quite powerful and to a degree have like deep pockets or at least funds to deploy. So if you can be the one to help them deploy them very effectively, that is something to be proud of.
Yeah, thanks.
Just summing it up for you.
No, exactly. No, I think you said it well. Even if we can direct certain funding to the watershed that is most in need of it. So often we're also asked to make a prioritization of like the 5 sites that are in the most water-stressed areas, for example. It's not a very difficult analysis, but that already can have a lot of impact because then you know where the funding needs to be directed. And and then if you then can, on top of that, do the problem analysis and provide solutions, that's really cool if you can do that.
Yes. Any exciting developments on the roadmap for the rest of 2023?
Yeah. So we are planning in Q3, Q4 to start with a quite large program. It's a bit research and development, but we from the start will also involve other stakeholders. Also together with the European Space Agency is expected, and together we'll focus more on advancing our systems to be better able to combine those climate models, the satellite Earth observation, and the impact on specifically crops. So we already are doing that, but we think we can make huge steps also when we have more collaboration with scientific institutes. And I think that I expect a lot from that program. It will be, I think, about 2 years, and it will start this year. But I think, it will be can have a lot of impact for, well, not only for ourselves, but especially for our clients. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Great, something to look forward to indeed, and on the horizon already. Like in Q4, you said you're going to start this.
Yeah, Q3 or Q4, or Q4. I hope.
Exciting. After the summer. Great.
Yeah.
Maybe you can give us an update on that project in the future.
Sure.
Awesome. All right. So I think, or I'm afraid with that, we are at time. So on behalf of our listeners, I would like to thank you very much for sharing your story and sharing what you know. If you're tuning in and you'd like to know more about 52impact, make sure to visit their website and socials. We'll leave those links in the description so you can check them out. Thanks for being here with us today, and until next one. Cheers.
Thanks so much.